I come here for a simple task, and that is to salute CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations. I come to salute their program of lobbying, of advocacy, and of creating understanding about the religion and the Deenul Islam. I come here to salute CAIR for combating anti-Muslim discrimination, Islamophobia, and every form of hate speech and hate action that this country has mustered against Muslims. Whether it is in the wearing of the hijab, in the stereotyping of films and books, in the hate crimes that have been committed against Muslims, and the profiling of atrocities and crimes of Muslims. I come here also to salute CAIR for condemning atrocities not only against Muslims, but often by Muslims as well, or in the name of Islam even. I also come to commend them for condemning terrorism and extremism, whether against Muslims or whether by Muslims in the name of Islam. I also come to salute CAIR for condemning suicide bombings as well as collective punishment as they happen in places in the Middle East. I also come to salute them for a campaign of engagement, because sometimes when people are under so much pressure, when people face so much wrath and so much misunderstanding and so much hatred, the tendency may well be to withdraw and to retreat. What CAIR has done is the counter-instinctive, rather to engage as opposed to retreat. Whether it is with the White House, whether it is with Congress and the Senate, whether it is with the leaders of other religions, with other civil rights groups, and even, importantly, in a Muslim world, diseased by sectarianism, to engage other Muslims as well for collaborative relations rather than simply competitive relations. And I also come to commend CAIR for their stoicism and resoluteness, their sabr, in the face of witch hunts, of allegations, of rumors and suspicions about CAIR itself and about its leaders. And in addressing the theme for tonight, faith in freedom, I'm not here to prescribe to you how you understand your faith and how you define your freedom. As an ambassador of South Africa, what I can do is to tell our story. If in that there's any relevance for you and any wisdom for you, then wallahu a'lam, then Allah knows best. But I simply want to start by saying thank you very much to CAIR for sharing this 19th banquet with myself and my country. It is indeed an honor. I come from, and I'm fortunate to be able to represent a country known for its epic battle against the greatest evil of the second half of the 20th century, apartheid. A country that has been able to touch the hearts and mobilize the spirit of thousands and millions of people across the world who had never known geographically where South Africa was, had never seen its people, had not seen the face of Nelson Mandela, but understood that there was a moral evil that needed to be confronted and were in the forefront, whether to be arrested outside our embassy, whether it was not eating an orange that came from South Africa, whether it was not unloading a ship in San Francisco carrying South African goods. Americans did that. British people did that, Europeans did that, Middle Eastern people did it. Apartheid moved the world, and we saw what happens when people combine their efforts against evil. Evil has no chance. وَقُلْ جَاءَ الْحَقِّ وَزَهَقَ الْبَاطِلُ إِنَّ الْبَاطِلَ كَانَ زَهُوقًا. I come from a country that has leaders and people that was able to showcase itself through the triumph of Nelson Mandela, who had every reason in this world to be extreme, who had every reason in this world to be bitter, to be angry, and to be vengeful. And yet, he chose not the extremes, but the middle ground. He chose not anger or bitterness, but chose instead to display the triumph of generosity and of forgiveness, and to work for the victory of reconciliation as the key methodology of combating evil in this world today. Put differently, South Africa demonstrated the effective deployment of soft power, a soft power that emerges from moral authority, a moral authority manifested in the actions of a people who do not, who refuse to imitate their oppressors, but understand that their own objectives and their own goals and their own values must be matched by the means and the methodologies that they employ to defeat the enemy and to defeat their evil. That if your objective is peace, you cannot worship violence as a methodology. If your objective is non-racialism and an anti-racist society, you cannot mobilize the racial feelings of your people. If your objective is justice for all, you cannot do justice to any, not even your enemy. And certainly not fight for justice between black and white while you do injustice to women at home. And therefore, fundamentally, it is the refusal to let your enemy or your opponent or your rival define you and determine for you your methodology. And it was so resonant with a beautiful qiraat, recital of the Quran, that we had from our Qari earlier this evening, the third ayah he recited. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kunu qawwamina bil qist. O you who believe, stand up as witnesses for Allah for justice. And we often inflame that into our passions. And we are willing to do that, but we don't read the fine script. And let not the hatred of a people to you make you depart from justice. Being wronged is not a license to wrong. And therefore our first battle is to make the Quran our character. As Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as our noble prophet, when Sayyidina Aisha was asked, how do you describe this man? She said, his character was the Quran. If that was good enough for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, why is it not good enough for us? Why do we allow ourselves to be defined by our tempers, by our anger, by our emotions, by our fanaticism, and by all the things that go into making us depart from justice and make us depart from making the Quran our character? Our second battle is to reclaim the values and the meaning of our faith. And the most important way that you can see the meaning of your faith and understand the values of your faith is to occupy the middle ground. When you stand on the edges, when you stand at the extremes, the values and the nature of your faith get distorted. When you stand in the center, you have this perfect vision of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects of you. And that is why we are described in the Quran as ummatan wasatan. The ummah, the community, who occupies the center, who is balanced, who is most middlemost, who occupies the middle ground. And so if we are to be ummatan wasatan, the community of the middle ground, what are some of us doing on the edges? What are some of us occupying the extremes for? And therefore, it is only from the middle that we can reclaim the best values, the best objectives, the best maqasid of our religion, of our faith. Because wasatiyah starts with a profound understanding, and this is where so many of us sometimes get it wrong, that the opposite of cowardice is not courage. The opposite of cowardice is recklessness. Courage is the perfect middle. Because courage is what it takes to be peaceful in a violent world. Courage is what it takes to warn each other about recklessness. Sometimes we lack the courage to tell the reckless amongst us, do not do that in our name. And in that same spirit, the opposite of war is not peace. The opposite of war is passivity. Because sometimes you can be passive in the face of injustice, when what you need is to be peaceful. Because peacefulness gives you the ability to know when you need to stand up and to know when you need to sit down. And therefore, in reclaiming our values, we need to say that from the vantage point of wasatiyah, from being in the middle, we claim courage as our garb, and we claim peace as our objective and our methodology. How do we fight for radical change? Not extremist change, radical change. How do we fight for revolutionary transitions? Not fundamentalist transitions. We've got to reclaim the methodologies that will make us a middle ground that truly speaks with a loud voice. Because we allow the extremes to dominate the debate as we go forward. And I say that because over a long 300 years of slavery, colonialism, segregation and apartheid in South Africa, we have learned the hard way how to find our center. We had experimented with the extremes and ultimately saw the triumph of those who occupy the middle ground. It's what makes Nelson Mandela revered. And so many people want to call him a saint and a prophet. So many people want to describe what he has done in South Africa as a miracle. And we say it may be divinely inspired, but it was not divinely done. Because the moment we concede that Nelson Mandela is a saint and the South African transition was a miracle, we say to other superpowers, you don't have to do that because it's not possible for you to do it. In fact, we insist it is possible for all societies to emulate what was done by people like Nelson Mandela and the great tradition of anti-apartheid strugglers and leaders in the country that I come from, South Africa. But those are the things that some of you know about South Africa. What is less known is the fact that for over 300 years, there has been a constant, durable presence of Islam and Muslims in South Africa. Our history is almost a mirror image of the history of the African American Muslims in the United States of America. We came from different places. They were taken from Africa and brought as slaves to the Americas. Our forefathers and mothers were taken from places like Indonesia, South Asia, and brought as slaves to Africa and settled in Cape Town. Over 300 years ago, Islam arrived in Cape Town, South Africa over 300 years ago as a community of slaves and political exiles, those who fought Dutch colonialism in the Southeast Asian areas. Islam as a religion was banned and forbidden. To be caught practicing your religion by way of prayer or any other form meant either the confiscation of your property, whatever you may have had, may have meant imprisonment, and often meant death. And therefore, the great leaders of the Muslim community of Cape Town, their graves have almost become shrines on the periphery of the then Cape Town, because that's where they fled to in order to continue their worship. It reminds us of that moment in the seerah, in the history of the early Muslims, when things were tough in Makkah, when Sumayyah, may Allah be pleased with her, when she was martyred, when Bilal was tortured, may Allah be pleased with him, when the Muslims were boycotted, the Prophet ﷺ was insulted. And the early Muslims were desperate. And Surah Buruj describes it beautiful. وَمَا نَقَمُوا مِنْهُمْ إِلَّا أَن يُؤْمِنُوا بِاللَّهِ الْعَزِيزِ الْحَمِيدِ. They were persecuted for no other reason except that they believed. If that is in the early history, if it continued 300 years ago from that moment in South Africa, if you feel those things happening to you even today in the United States of America, then our task is to organize. Our task is to mobilize. Our task is to fundraise. Our task is to conscientize our country and to conscientize our neighbors. Our task is to win over people. It's not to complain. We ask the simple question, what must we do? What are the maqasid al-sharia? What are the objectives of our faith? And we learn then that the objectives of our faith, that the objectives come first and the rules follow. That the values come first and the rituals follow. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam comes first and the sheikhs follow. And out of that comes the unique distillation of the need for justice, the need to fight for equality, the need to fight for inclusivity, the need to stand together, to build broader alliances, the need to make common cause with others who suffer, not because they are Muslim but because they are black. Not because they are Muslim, but because they are the first peoples, the indigenous peoples. Because sometimes we can cocoon ourselves in our own victimization and not see the victimization in the other. That's the difficulty with victimization. It becomes an obsessive thing with you sometimes, that you can't see victimhood in others who are victims because they are black, because they are indigenous, because they live on a particular piece of land, because they speak a particular language, because their religion too is foreign to the ruling class. And it's unfortunate that sometimes you learn about justice and peace and non-discrimination and freedom in the absence thereof. And that is sometimes the tragedy. And the Quran is there amongst others to short-circuit that learning curve, that we don't have to be absent of something in order to know its value. That's what should make Muslims different and unique. That before they lose something, they know it. Our orthodoxy sometimes taught us to fight only for Islam, not for nationalism, not for communism, not for secularism, not for any other ism. And it's a compelling idea. To a young mind it makes sense. How can you fight for anything but Islam? Until we learned the Hadith Qudsi, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to tell us that Allah prefers the non-Muslim ruler who is just to the Muslim ruler who is unjust. And it stripped us of all self-righteousness, not righteousness, self-righteousness. Because we were forced by that Hadith Qudsi to see virtue in the others and that we don't have a monopoly of virtue. In fact, it was like a great jigsaw puzzle of life. We all had pieces of the puzzle. It needed to be put together to create a better life for all in South Africa and ultimately, I think, in the world. Sometimes our orthodoxy teaches us to be uncompromising in giving the message of Islam. And so we were. that at every political rally where blacks were fighting for non-discrimination against the past laws, we would want to quote a Quran ayah to show how virtuous we were in that fight, as opposed to getting into the fight. And we were uncompromising until we realized a fundamental sequencing in the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Simple. We teach it at madrasas every day. We tell it to our children every day, but as a story, not as a life lesson. We realized that before Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was Rasulullah, he was Al-Amin. Before he was the messenger of God, he was the trustworthy. You cannot give a message if you are not trusted. You cannot appeal to people to understand you if your whole appearance does not bring trust. You cannot say, don't be suspicious, if you allow some in your name to act suspiciously. And therefore, what made the message of the Prophet ﷺ so compelling was that everyone who disagreed with him knew they couldn't question his integrity, his trustworthiness. And we must ask, how do we enable ourselves to reach that level of trust in our society so that we are seen not as a force to be discriminated against, but a force for good in society as a whole. It is not known, but Nelson Mandela was in prison for 27 years. That's known. And Imam Siraja has told us that piece of history. But what people don't know is that in the cell next to him for almost 27 years was Ahmad Kathrada. Oliver Tambo, the exiled leader of the African National Congress, was in exile for 30 years. That's known. What is not known, that for almost that entire 30 years, occupying the office next to him was Dr. Yusuf Dadoo. Everyone knows that Steve Biko was tortured to death in apartheid's jails. What people don't know is so was Ahmad Timol and Imam Abdullah Harun, an imam from Cape Town, tortured to death, Ahmad Timol thrown from the 10th floor of the Security Services building in Johannesburg. And so unless you are able to make the sacrifices that your society is making, and not simply to sympathize but to empathize, we will not narrow the trust deficit that exists in our society and eliminate the barriers that exist between us. See, kindness is an act of the heart. Justice is often an act of the head. We can be technically just. Here's yours, here's mine. But kindness is the extra. And we were challenged. How are we kind in a society that has opened its heart to us and given us? And this is where we then understood that South Africa had the possibility, and I put this to you as a possible objective. South Africa had the possibility of being a laboratory to see whether any country in the world where Muslims are a minority can indeed become a Darul Aman, a place of security, a Darus Salam, a place of peace, and a Darus Shahada, a place for the free confession and profession of your faith, privately and publicly. And therefore, we decided for ourselves that our objective in this world, in the absence of a clear definition and sometimes in the presence of distortion, that our objective was not to try and create out of South Africa a Darul Islam, a place for Islam, And South Africa was certainly no longer a place that we could call a Darul Harb, a place of hostility. But that in between, there's a wonderful shared space in which we can be and let others be. But it needed certain basic things. This Darul Shahada. It needed us not to isolate ourselves in our mosque, in our group area, in our community, in our friendship circle, that we needed not to assimilate, because at the heart of the word assimilate is the core, to become the same, but to integrate. And at the core of the word integrate is the imperative to retain integrity. And we understood it is not simply us retaining our integrity, but us paying homage to the integrity of the nation also to have its identity. And therefore the tension wasn't whether we have unity or diversity. The question was how much unity with our nation and how much diversity to be Muslim. And every nation has to work out its particular tipping point between how much unity is comfortable, not too much because then you become a melting pot, and how much diversity is possible, not too much, because then you don't have any respect for the national aspiration as well. And those were the challenges that we faced. A second challenge that we faced: could we claim rights for ourselves and not give it to others, even if we dislike their lifestyle? Because to open the door of discrimination to someone else is to keep it open for when someone who doesn't like you come into power. And so sometimes it may be sexy to fight all manner of enemies, but every battle you fight opens the door wider. You have given permission for what may not now be against you, but what could later be against you. We faced a similar question. Can we fight for a masjid in a white area in Cape Town, but we don't stand up for the right of a church to have a church in a country in the Middle East? Consistency means that what you fight for yourself, you've got to fight for others. Consistency means that the rights you demand when you're a minority are the rights you must give when you're a majority. If there is an inconsistency, you have forfeited all trust. I want to end by saying, and Imam Siraj was competing against the Syria syndrome tonight. It's important. We have learned as South Africans, and it was amplified at the United Nations this week, where I was accompanying our President and our Minister of Foreign Affairs. If you make your organizations and you make the Council on American Islamic Relations successful here, and you build trust here, and you reduce the fear of Islam and Muslims here, and you show your compatibility with democracy and freedom here, and you show that you are able to integrate seamlessly here, and be a contributing member of society here, you make the world safe for Islam. Your task, under the leadership of your imams and under the leadership of organizations like CAIR, is to win the trust, to show that we are Al-Amin, to be able to say that we are Democrats, we are freedom-loving, we can live with equality. You don't have to fear us, you can trust us. And if you do that, you make the task in the Middle East and everywhere where Muslims are so much easier. Wallahu a'lam. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.